On Saturday, July 4th, while the United States was celebrating its 250th Independence Day, the secure phone line inside the White House was active for nearly 90 minutes. Donald Trump was on the phone with Vladimir Putin. Immediately afterward, Trump placed a second call to Kiev to speak with Volodymyr Zelensky. Officially, the Kremlin described the call as a businesslike and highly constructive conversation aimed at finding a rapid end to the fighting. But behind the diplomatic pleasantries, the timing wasn't an accident. This frantic weekend of telephone diplomacy happened exactly 3 days before the highly anticipated NATO summit in Turkey, where the future of Western military aid hangs in the balance. Right as those calls concluded, Putin held a staged briefing with General Valery Gerasimov, loudly claiming that Russian forces had just completely captured the strategic stronghold of Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region. Zelensky immediately fired back, calling it a flat-out fabrication. The timing tells you everything. This wasn't just a military report, it was a coordinated information play designed to shift the leverage right as Trump steps in to mediate. To understand why a 90-minute phone call between Washington and Moscow matters, we have to look past the political theater and examine the grinding, unglamorous reality of modern industrial warfare. The conflict in Ukraine has fundamentally outgrown the sweeping, fast-moving armored maneuvers that define 20th century doctrine. We are no longer seeing the mass tank charges of Operation Desert Storm or the rapid blitzkriegs of World War II. Instead, the theater has degraded into a brutal war of attrition governed by pure engineering friction, raw manufacturing output, and logistical bottlenecks. Think of the entire war zone right now like a massive, multi-billion-dollar manufacturing corporation trying to execute a hostile takeover of a smaller competitor. The aggressor has more raw materials, more cash reserves, and a larger workforce. But every time they try to move their delivery trucks out of the warehouse, their fuel lines are severed, their tires are slashed, and the factories supplying them back home are mysteriously catching fire. That is exactly the dynamic playing out across the 1,200-kilometer front line. Russia's primary strategic objective remains the total capture of the Donbas region, specifically the industrial spine running through Donetsk and Luhansk. To achieve this, the Russian General Staff relies on a doctrine of overwhelming mass. They deploy hundreds of thousands of mobilized troops, backed by heavy artillery fire, to literally flatten Ukrainian defensive positions yard by yard. However, in the dirt, implementing this doctrine requires an astronomical logistical footprint. A single Russian motor rifle division consumes hundreds of tons of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and, most critically, thousands of gallons of refined diesel fuel every single day. Moving these supplies from deep inside the Russian Federation to the mud-soaked roads of eastern Ukraine requires a complex chain of rail networks, vulnerable supply hubs, and thousands of soft-skinned transport trucks. Ukraine, realizing it cannot match Russia soldier for soldier or shell for shell in a prolonged meat grinder, has completely inverted its defensive strategy. The Ukrainian General Staff has transitioned to a doctrine of asymmetric air interdiction. Utilizing an incredibly dense network of long-range, AI-integrated strike drones, Ukraine has stopped focusing exclusively on the Russian troops sitting in the trenches. Instead, they are bypassing the front lines entirely. They are flying hundreds of miles deep into sovereign Russian territory to strike the economic valves, thermal power stations, and oil refineries that act as the circulatory system for Putin's military machine. By turning the interior of Russia into an active combat zone, Ukraine is attempting to induce a systemic heart attack in the Russian military supply chain, starving the heavy armor of fuel before it can ever reach the battlefield. When you strip away the propaganda from both sides and look at the raw logistical data, the sheer friction of this war becomes blindingly obvious. According to the latest comprehensive battlefield data compiled by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, the Russian ground offensive has hit a massive structural wall. In the critical operational sectors of Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, and Sloviansk, Russian advancements have slowed down to an absolute crawl, averaging a net forward movement of just 50 to 90 meters per day. To put that in context, that is nearly identical to the static, frozen trench lines of the Western Front during the First World War. In fact, if you zoom out to the broader spring campaign, Russia's heavy territorial losses actually outweighed their gains. Following a series of highly localized, drone-coordinated counterpushes by Ukrainian brigade-level groups, Moscow suffered a net loss of roughly 400 square kilometers of occupied territory across the entire theater. The human cost required to maintain even these double-digit meter advances is completely unsustainable by modern military standards. The verified numbers from CSIS indicate that total Russian battlefield casualties, encompassing killed in action, severely wounded, and missing, have reached an astronomical figure of approximately 1.4 million personnel since the invasion began in February 2022. Within that number, independent intelligence agencies estimate up to 450,000 total fatalities. Currently, Russia is burning through human capital at a rate of roughly 30,000 casualties per month. Conversely, despite offering massive sign-on bonuses exceeding 2 million rubles in some federal regions, Russia's domestic recruitment drives are only netting about 27,000 new contract soldiers a month. This human deficit is being driven directly by Ukraine's technological transformation. By integrating automated drone grids with real-time satellite reconnaissance, Ukraine has turned the airspace above the trenches into a kinetic trap. In active sectors like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, the casualty ratio has blown out to a staggering 8-to-1 in Ukraine's favor. But the most devastating math for Vladimir Putin isn't happening on the front line, it's happening at the oil pumps. Over the last several months, Ukraine's long-range drone fleet has successfully executed precision strikes on over 30 major Russian energy facilities. This coordinated campaign has knocked out or severely degraded approximately 42% of Russia's total domestic oil refining capacity. Just days before the Trump-Putin phone call, a swarm of low-flying Ukrainian strike drones completely bypassed local air defenses to hit the Michurinskaya thermal plant and vital fuel storage reservoirs in the Belgorod Oblast. The structural damage from these strikes has triggered a cascading domestic fuel crisis across the Russian Federation. Because Russia's internal rail grid is already completely clogged with military transport trains, they cannot easily move refined fuel from untouched refineries in Siberia to the western provinces. As a direct result, local governments in major maritime and industrial hubs like Novorossiysk, Krasnodar, and even distant administrative zones like Zabaikalsky Krai have been forced to implement emergency fuel rationing. Civilian gas stations are actively running dry, and regional authorities have banned the private sale of premium gasoline and diesel to ensure that every available drop is preserved for the military's logistics columns. But here's the part almost everyone leaves out when they analyze these massive economic numbers and draw sweeping conclusions. When mainstream Western commentators see a statistic showing a 42% drop in Russian oil refining capacity, or read reports of gas lines forming in Krasnodar, they immediately jump to the conclusion that the Russian war machine is on the verge of an imminent catastrophic collapse. They assume that tanks will stop moving in the Donbass next week because the fuel tanks are empty. This is an incredibly naive misunderstanding of how authoritarian state economies and military logistics actually operate under pressure. In a total war scenario, military logistics do not behave like a civilian market economy. Vladimir Putin and the Russian Security Council do not care if an ordinary Russian civilian living in Chita or Vladivostok has to stand in a queue for 6 hours just to buy 5 gallons of low-grade fuel for their personal vehicle. They do not care if domestic inflation rises or if small agricultural businesses suffer because they cannot secure fuel for their tractors. In the calculus of the Kremlin, the civilian population exists to absorb economic pain. The Russian state will gladly let its domestic economy choke, ration power to major cities, and completely freeze civilian energy distribution to guarantee that a single diesel convoy successfully reaches the 90th Guards Tank Division operating in the ruins of Donetsk. Therefore, the operational friction created by Ukraine's drone campaign isn't that Russia will literally run out of crude oil. Russia sits on top of some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves on the planet. They have an endless supply of raw crude. The real bottleneck is a complex engineering and transport problem. It is the friction of refining that raw crude into high-grade military propellants and then moving those volatile liquids hundreds of miles under constant aerial threat. When Ukraine enforces what military planners call a logistics lockdown on occupied regions like the Crimean Peninsula, they aren't just target practicing on individual armored vehicles. They are systematically destroying the fixed infrastructure, the permanent rail bridges, the large fuel depots, and the specialized port facilities. By blowing up the Chonhar rail bridge and targeting oil tankers in the Black Sea, Ukraine forces the Russian military to reroute millions of gallons of fuel via highly inefficient temporary pontoon bridges or lengthy truck convoys across exposed dirt roads. This creates an absolute administrative and engineering nightmare for Russian logistics officers. Every mile a fuel truck has to drive across an unpaved bypass is a mile where it can break down, get stuck in the mud, or be spotted by a Ukrainian drone operator. The real danger for Ukraine, however, is that this is a race against time. The fundamental flaw in the Western analysis is underestimating Russia's capacity to tolerate structural friction. The Russian military-industrial complex has shown a remarkable ability to adapt, repair infrastructure using primitive engineering workarounds, and endure levels of economic misery that would instantly cause a political revolution and collapse a Western democracy. Putin is betting his entire strategic hand on a simple premise. He can outlast the political patience of Washington and the physical capacity of Ukraine's drone manufacturers, regardless of how much fuel his country burns through to get there. So the ultimate trajectory of this war isn't being decided by the bloody infantry engagements inside the ruins of Kostiantynivka, despite the high-profile media narratives pushed by the Kremlin's public relations apparatus. The real outcome of this conflict depends entirely on a cold, unsentimental mathematical race. Can Ukraine's deep drone strikes structurally fracture Russia's internal energy infrastructure and create a genuine military supply failure before the shifting political winds in Western capitals, cut off Ukraine's own economic and military lifelines? The next critical turning point in this geopolitical calculation is already fixed on the international calendar. On Tuesday, July 7th, the heads of state and military commanders of the NATO alliance will convene for a highly sensitive emergency summit in Ankara, Turkey. Donald Trump will arrive at that summit holding the raw diplomatic leverage from his 90-minute weekend call with Vladimir Putin and his subsequent briefing with Volodymyr Zelensky. The closed-door negotiations in Ankara will not be about abstract ideals of democracy or international law. They will be about concrete numbers, the exact tonnage of artillery shells remaining in Western stockpiles, the delivery schedules of long-range air defense missiles, and the precise level of economic pressure Washington is willing to apply to force a settlement. The decisions made by the alliance in Turkey this week will dictate whether Ukraine will be quietly pressured into a frozen conflict, trading occupied territory for a fragile peace, or whether they will be given the financial backing and long-range weapons permissions required to permanently cut Russia's economic windpipe. Keep your eyes on the official communiques coming out of Ankara over the next 48 hours. That is where the actual blueprint for the endgame of the European continent is being written.